Okay, so this is Women in Revolutionary War Part 2, since it was going a little long in the last recording. As I mentioned, I totally forgot to go over Hannah Griffith's poem when we were talking about the boycotts, so I have put it here because I cannot find the online version of this, so I just took a picture of the book and put it here so we could see it. And that way at least I'm not just reading it, you can actually see it as I'm reading it. Now, because of course I had to take a picture of the book, it already has my notes on it, so I'll probably just mention those notes rather than writing too much on this. So this we'll put here with that the boycotts. So this was in response to the boycotts when she wrote this. Okay, and this initially, and it talks about it in the introduction here, but that she initially passed it around with some of her women friends, and then it ended up getting published. So this is a good example of what I was talking about with the Daughters of Liberty and the Spinning Bees and the women moving into political interest with being involved in publishing in the newspapers and writing pieces. They did poems, but also actual like political pieces as well. And this was a poem, but it definitely was making a political statement and point. So let's go through it. Like I said, you can kind of see my notes, so you can get the key points I'm going to pull out of that anyway. But I do want to read through it because I really like this poem because it's very snarky towards the Sons of Liberty and men in general about their inaction. Because remember, women were the ones really pulling the boycott. They had to forcibly make some men follow the boycott, and so this was meant to be snarky. It was meant to highlight women's roles and what they were doing and how they were basically pulling all the weight in the boycott. And then she targets the Sons of Liberty specifically because, right, they were the more active and proactive group in a lot of ways. And yet, in this case, right, the women were the ones that were doing all of the heavy lifting. So since the men from a party on fear of frown, right, so then you have my notes here, that what it means is that they're afraid of being punished with a frown, right? Or just even being disapproved of. So just from fear of a frown, are kept by a sugar plum quietly down. So the sugar plum is like a little sugar candy, and it's just like saying that just from the most simplest thing, right? The men are not acting. Supinely asleep and deprived of their sight, are stripped of their freedom and robbed of their right. So that's just claiming that the men are asleep, and while they're asleep, and not necessarily literally asleep, but you know, you're not paying attention, they're being deprived of their freedoms and their rights. If the sons, and the capital S, this is the Sons of Liberty, so degenerate the blessing despise, let the Daughters of Liberty nobly arise, right? So if the Sons of Liberty, if the men aren't going to do it, the Daughters of Liberty will. And though we've no voice, but a negative here, right? That's no political voice, that's no vote. The use of the taxables let us forbear. So let us go against, right? Talk about merchants import till your stores are all full. May the buyers be few and your traffic be dull. So then it's saying, right, well, the merchants, so when it's saying here, I didn't underline this part, the merchants import till your stores are all full. This means that they're breaking the boycott, which there was issues with the merchants continuing to try to stock their stores and sell the goods that were being boycotted. So they're breaking, the merchants, right? Let's clarify there, are breaking the boycott, or at least, you know, trying to get people to break the boycott. So then it's saying, will the buyers be few and the traffic dull, right? So that hopefully people won't be purchasing goods. Stand firmly resolved and bid Greenville to sea. And it mentions it here, right? Greenville refers to Lord George Greenville, the Chancellor of the British Exchange and author of The Hated Taxes. So he was that there. She's calling him out. That rather than freedom, we'll part with our tea. So that was the reference of, right, that we're willing to give up the beloved tea. And well as we love the dear drought when a dry, as American patriots, our taste we deny. So again, it's lamenting the benefit, the like of tea, but we're willing to give up tea, the sacrifice, right, as I mentioned here, of as American patriots. Join mutual in this, and but small as it seems, we may jostle a Greenville and puzzle his schemes. So that's just saying that if they joined together and worked together, they could disrupt what Greenville was trying to do with the taxes. But a motive more worthy our patriot pen, thus acting we point out their duty to men. So then it's saying, right, and with a pen, with writing this poem, we're pointing out what the men's duty that they're not doing. And should the bound pensioners tell us to hush, so that, right, should the men tell us to be quiet, it's not our place in society, we can throw back the satire by bidding them blush. We can throw it back in their faces by making them feel embarrassed or blush. So this was both, like I said, snarky. It's both praising women and what they were doing for the boycott, and at the same time, calling out the men that weren't doing their part for the boycott. Basically trying to shame them into saying, you guys are not doing your duty. The women are pulling all the weight, and we're American patriots, and what are you doing? And if the men then try to tell us that this isn't our role, this isn't our position, go back to the home, then we can throw it back at them with satire by making them feel embarrassed. So this was the type of stuff. There were more straightforward things that just talked about politics and talked about women's roles within this structure, and there definitely were several with women defining, like, this is why we are supposed to be a part of this, because there was pushback sometimes with women aren't supposed to be part of the political structure, and so they did write about, like, this is why women should be involved. And then you had some like this, which were more snarky is still the best word for it, as far as trying to show not only what women were doing, but that they were pulling the weight. Because there definitely was at the beginning a lot published about what men were doing, and the women were like, whoa, hey, we are doing all of the work here. And so that did get put out there. She does it this way, and there were others that wrote about, like, that this wouldn't be happening if the women weren't doing all the work as well. So they were very aware and cognizant of the fact that they were not only moving into the political realm, which was traditionally seen as a male thing, but that they were the ones that were holding it together. So women were very aware and clear on that. So yeah, anyways, that's the poem. So the next thing, we were still on the home front and looking at different structures. The next one I wanted to look at, so we'll keep the home front here, was political identity, which this works with as well, even though I wanted it to be with the boycotts, because that was when it was written and what it was about. You have women that before the Revolutionary War and during struggled with political identity. And we're going to look at Abigail Adams in a minute and her letters to her husband, which were technically before the full-on Revolutionary War, but it fits with this where women saw themselves within that. Of course, you have the femme covert that we've talked about, that is creating some of the issues for women. If you remember with femme covert, this was for married women, and technically women who were not married and were still living at home. Widows and older women would be femme sole. But with married women, right, their identity in most ways became, let's just say, became their husbands. So when they got married, you kind of lost your identity and your agency to your husband. And this included political identity. The assumption was that women didn't have, especially married women, did not have their own identity. Okay, that once you got married, I guess it was kind of like that. Before you got married, it was whatever your father's was, and then once you got married, then it was your husband's. And this is directly related to the idea of the political sphere was for men and not women. And obviously we've seen in what we've looked at so far that that's not the case. Clearly, I mean, even this poem shows that women felt that they had their own identity, and that they had a right to be there. I mean, this if you go back here, right? She's expecting that, and the bound pensioners is also a dig on older men. The older men should tell us to hush. It also could be, I suppose, well, mostly it was older men that way, not really older women. But so there's an expectation there that the men are going to tell them to be quiet in the political realm. They were fully aware of that, and so as much as there's the femme covert and the legal aspect of it. Women were pushing back against that and saying, no, we not only do we have a right and we should be a part of this, and we are, and you should recognize that, and the men are supposed to be and they're not. But we'll see with Abigail Adams, you also have a desire and push to have more political rights and political identity, right? So where this became, so there's a couple areas that this became problematic, and then we'll look at how women were pushing for more political identity. Besides what we just looked at could be a push for that as well. So you have the main issue of where this became problematic for women outside of just them people telling them that it wasn't their realm was with loyalists, and more specifically the husbands that were loyalists. Okay, so not everyone agreed with their husbands on that, and there was probably a spectrum. So what would happen is, right, the husbands that were loyalists were the ones that supported the British. The patriots were the ones that supported the revolution. Okay, so those are the two names for them. So if I say loyalist, is talking about those supporting the British. If I say patriots, which Hannah mentions in the poem as American patriots, that was supporting the revolution. So husbands that were loyalist would often leave to fight with the British. Okay, they went over to the British side and fought with them. In this, when this happened, their wives, wife and children stayed at wherever they lived, remained behind. Not all of the time. There were some that went with their husbands, but many stayed behind. And there's a couple reasons for this. One of the biggest ones was property. There was a fear, legitimately, because it happened, that they would lose their property if they left. And even if the British won, right, that before that happened, their property would be confiscated and they wouldn't get it back. And your property was your livelihood and your wealth. So it was a big deal. So what they hoped is that by having the wife and children remain behind, stay behind, that it would they would be able to keep property. Okay, the other thing besides property was that for some women, did not agree with their husbands. And there is a variety of the men who were loyalists, that were some who were ardent supporters, some who felt that they had an obligation to do so, but didn't really necessarily support that. There was a wide spectrum of why someone went and fought with the British as a loyalist. And so you had either two kind of things. One, the women didn't care or just agreed with their husbands who were loyalists, but they stayed behind to try to keep their property. And of course, your life and your kid's life was there, and the women weren't going to go fight. So, especially with the British side, we saw how some women dressed up as men, but those were usually women who weren't married and didn't have children, and so they weren't going to go fight with the British side, and so they just stay and you live your life. Then you have, like I said, the other women who, as their husbands were gone, didn't actually agree politically with their husbands. Unfortunately for them, and for loyalists in general, if you were in an area that was British controlled, then it was one thing. But there were loyalists that were throughout the colonies that weren't fighting, or the women that stayed behind, and they were usually treated, even the women, very poorly. You have aspects of people that were physically attacked, and women included, for being loyalist, or really having husbands who were loyalists, because remember, they didn't technically have an identity outside of their husbands. You had verbal abuse. They also did, even with the women staying behind in some areas, they did confiscate their property, took their property. Now, this worked in a couple of ways. Usually what would happen is the town would give them notice to move out. Basically saying, you've been deemed a loyalist and you have so many days to move out. Many women refused because, again, the importance of property, and some because they said, I'm not a loyalist, and often then they were physically removed from the home and kicked out, and not nicely. So this left them destitute. Now, some went to live with their husbands on the British side after this. Others did not. But you were attacked if you were a known loyalist, or your husband, again, more importantly, your husband was a known loyalist. So for some of these women, though, they were not loyalists, and they supported the colonist side. And so after the war, several women actually sued the colony, or what becomes the state, right? The colony /state for property and wealth lost, hoping to get back their property, or at least the money that was lost. And their claim was that always a patriot, right? My husband might have been a loyalist, but I was not. And they gave a testimony in court how they taught their children patriot values. They said how some supported the patriots financially. Right, so that, like, look, I gave money to the Patriot side. Some argued that they helped in other ways, right? Whether that was giving information, providing tips, or just support. And they said, here's all my proof. So they had proof. They came into court. They said, look, I've got proof. I was kicked out of my home, but I am a patriot. I did not support the loyalists. And they mentioned the other things too. So they said usually it was connected with stopped communicating with my husband, right? Once he went over to the British side, I didn't write to him, I didn't communicate with him. Like basically we broke up kind of thing. And they tried to prove that they had nothing to do with their husband, they weren't helping him, or that they disowned their husband essentially. Women, remember, couldn't really divorce and initiate divorce. So their way of showing that they were essentially divorcing him without being able to legally do it was I'd stop communicating with them. I didn't want to have anything to do with them. We taught our children, I taught my children these values, I supported them. And what the court decision was that may be so, but fem cover. And because of fem cover, if your husband is a loyalist or was a loyalist, you are a loyalist. And it doesn't matter your actions, right? So this is saying actions don't matter. And they did not get their property back. They did not get money in compensation or anything like that. So some women really got screwed over because their husband was a loyalist and because of fem cover, that were truly honestly supportive of the Patriots and pretty much disowned their husband and still lost everything. Then there were the women who were actually loyalists, who supported their husbands and the British, and they also often lost everything. If they managed to hold onto their property during the war, when the war was over, all loyalists that were known, so let's put all known loyalists, I suppose there were probably some that kept quiet, but that silently supported the British and hedged their bets on who would win. All known loyalists were essentially kicked out of the country. So there were two options with that. If you got kicked out of the country, you could go, some families went to go with the British, right, to say Britain. And then you had others who went to Canada. The people who went to Britain tended to be the wealthy people. And the people who went to Canada were the ones that couldn't afford the trip to Britain. And because to go to live in Britain, to go back to the mother country was seen as the ideal if you were a true loyalist. But it was expensive. So the wealthy were the ones that were able to do so. Here's the issue with this that was unfortunate, is that those who went to Britain found themselves not always attacked, but life was usually hard for the women and the men. Unless you were like filthy rich. Unless you were super, super rich. The very, very wealthy, or those that came from distinguished families, might have been okay. But everyone else that had enough money to go but weren't of that upper 1%, 0.5%, life was difficult because the British people saw them as colonists and different. And so it didn't matter. And not only that, and so they basically said, well, you're not really British, but also that we can't trust you and could not be trusted. And their logic for this was, well, you betrayed the colonies, which, I mean, it's messed up logic, because they're like, no, we stayed loyal. It's in our freaking name, loyalist. We stayed loyal to the British people, to our country. And the British were like, yeah, you're colonist. You're not British, which was kind of the sentiment at this point. And therefore, you didn't stay loyal to the colonists and the colonies. You betrayed them for us. And instead of being like, thank you for your sacrifice in supporting us, or the recognition of, oh, you stayed loyal to us, because they saw them as different, then they were seen as not being able to be trusted, that they'd somehow betrayed their country, even though it wasn't a separate country at the time. It's warped logic. But that's what they basically faced discrimination when they went back to Britain, which sucked for them. And most of the people who went to Britain didn't come back to the US later. Those who went to Canada had a much easier time. I guess I should have just put it underneath it. Those who went to Canada, they had an easier time. And you see that influence of the British in Canada still to this day, and the connection to the crown. So there's a direct influence to current day Canada from these people that went to Canada after. Easier time, and they had the opportunity to come back. It took about 5 years. But within 5 years, it was kind of like all is forgiven. And people could move loyalists could move back if they wanted to the US, to the now United States. Some did, some did not. It kind of depended on those who weren't really strong loyalists were usually the ones, if they had moved to Canada, came back. Women who were forcibly removed, even after they tried to sue and had supported the Patriots, even with being like burned by the court system, they often did have support of the people. So you had two ways that this happened. Some women who were not loyalists, but their husbands were attacked and kicked out. Others they didn't lose their property because the community knew who they were and had theirs and supported them. But when the requirement came for loyalists to leave, the courts made that decision and said, well, with the legal rule of femme covert on the books, it doesn't matter. And there was some acknowledgement that was unfortunate and that they believed them that they were patriots, but by legal rules, this was the situation. Those women tended to come back. They usually went to Canada because they weren't super wealthy anymore, and in fact usually weren't with their husbands who went, a lot of the men who fought with the British went back to Britain. And so they often came back. And again, some of the more weaker patriot or loyalists, or those who just wanted to go back to what they saw as home, went back. But there were plenty that stayed in Canada, which, like I mentioned, influences Canada's structure, political structure, and connection to the UK to this day. And then you had the people who went to Britain, even with they really, like I said, they had a crappier time. And most of them didn't come back even with being treated like crap, because it was just so expensive. And they were usually the ones that went to Britain were usually the ones that were the more ardent loyalist anyway. And so that they probably were still against the United States. But in all of this, right, women were kind of dragged around without having a lot of choice. Even when they tried to assert political identity, the courts shut them down because of femme covert. So you have like the Hannah Griffiths one where they're showing where they had their own political identity, but that was okay because it wasn't a legal thing. But the instant it moved to the legal realm, it was made very clear that women still didn't have their own political identity. So you have this interesting dichotomy in the Revolutionary War between women pushing and asserting and showing, well, really through all of femme covert, pushing and asserting their political identity, and that they had an independent political identity. And then the court saying no. Now, of course, there are differences. Most of the Daughters of Liberty, their husbands were also patriots, and so that was acceptable a little bit more than women whose husbands were loyalists, because your political identity was your husband. So it worked great if your political identity was the same as your husband's, if you agreed. But it was not a good system for women who found themselves not agreeing with their husband's political identity. So the next one after loyalist, so we're on 3, is looking at Abigail Adams. That one I think I have, here. So let's put that, we'll write it and then we'll look at the source. So Abigail Adams was John Adams' wife, and they wrote a ton of letters to each other. There were lots of times where they were apart as John Adams was going around with his as a lawyer, and then also later with working on the founding of the nation. And so we have all of these letters that they wrote to each other. And in one of them, she talks about women and rights, which is going to include the political, which this is going to also include an idea of political identity, and specifically trying to push for including women in the new code of laws, is what she called it. Right, we get that you're going to be creating a new code of laws. We want in, kind of thing. So you see, like, from the very beginning of the start of the United States, even prior to it, women were pushing for being included and having a political voice. And we see it informally, and like I said, in these documents of the poems and newspaper articles, and then we see it more formally within court cases, and then in letters to, you know, her husband was working on those things, so she was hoping that she could get him to make those changes that would have a significant legal impact on women being able to have a voice. So let's look at the source. So Abigail Adams, remember the ladies, is taken from where she asked for that. So you have, I put two. There's several different, let's not do that. There we go. There's several different letters and examples. These two are excerpts from it. So they're actually longer parts of the letter, but we picked out the things that were kind of important. That's talking about Abigail Adams asking for her husband to include women, and then her husband's response. So let's look at Abigail Adams to John Adams first. She said, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." So there's the title, right? "Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." So this is significant. We're going to see the, let's call it Revolutionary War language. Okay, that she's going to use it. Her husband, we're going to look at the importance of how he uses it. And you have African Americans using it. You have Native Americans using it. Everyone, basically all of the disenfranchised groups and minorities in the colonies at the time are like, this language is familiar. We can connect and identify to it. And if you guys are using it, let's use it for our cause to show how we're connected. And so it was two parts. One, it was familiar wording of like the Revolutionary War language. Let's put it down here, right? The language. You have tyrant. You have slavery, oppression. You have despotism. Which despotism is cruel rule, basically. So a despot would be someone who was a cruel ruler. Despotism is the rule itself, but not just cruel rule, let's say cruel and harsh rule. And then, of course, there were words like freedom, liberty, equality. So it should not be surprising that when we talk about African Americans and for both the free black population and slaves, were initially drawn to the revolution, the patriot side, because they used language of against tyrant, against oppression, against slavery, against despotism for freedom, liberty, and equality. Like, yes, that's what we want. And it's not surprising that women were like, yes, that's what we want. Everyone that was not part, a disenfranchised group and oppressed and a minority within the colonies was like, exactly, we get that. And we totally agree. And so then when, in various stages, tried to showcase that, and use that language to show that they identified with it. But so that was part of it, right? Identification. You use that language to show that you, because you identify with it. The other reason they used it is because they were hoping that it would be more persuasive if they use the language of the revolutionaries, the patriots, right? If we say, this is your wording, guys. This is the language you're using, and we're showing you how it applies to us as well. And it was more convincing to some, not enough to make massive change. We'll see she does not get what she asked for here. We'll see that the petitions from the African American community, both free and slave, did not get what they wanted. Pretty much everyone that was like, hey, we're included in this too. Equality, freedom, and liberty, and then I think John Adams' response here is good in showing how that was shut down, and even for women even more, because you have basically two kind of things: women, and here with Abigail Adams, and then you're looking at black women, and it's kind of like a double punch, because you have both the rejection against slavery and saying, nah, we're going to keep it. Again, there were some early colonies that did make changes because of recognizing the parallel and how it was not compatible, but a lot of obviously did not. And then you have the second aspect of that is, and also because you're a woman, there's all these other issues that you don't get included in as well. And so women kind of dealt with, especially with minorities, in this kind of double problematic realm of being rejected and not getting any rights. You don't get any rights as a woman, and you don't get any rights as a black woman. You don't get any rights as a woman and as a Native American, and so on and so on. So she says, right, she uses that language, tyrant. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. So she's saying, all I'm asking is that you don't take you get the unlimited power out of husbands, which is definitely going to Femme Covert and addressing that. And then saying that, right, if all men could, they would be tyrants. And if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion. And will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Voice and representation, that's the vote, right? And we should say, and positions in the government, involvement in the government. She never specifies whether that's like official positions or just some involvement. So she's asking from pre-Revolutionary War, 1776, at the eve of the Revolutionary War, we want the vote. We want to be able to vote, and we want representation in the government. And then the fact of using the rebellion, right? That hey, you guys just revolted, you just rebelled. The Declaration of Independence says that those who don't have a government that supports that should rebel. Well, we're determined to rebel if you don't include that in. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. So you're saying, no one's going to argue that men are tyrannical, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Again, the use of master and free, right? So saying men are yes, that men, a lot of men are naturally tyrannical, but the men who want to be happy when married, basically, give up the title of master willingly, by choice, and become a friend. So this is her trying to finesse her husband, right? So why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? So here she's saying, right, most of you are good husbands, and you willingly choose out of your own choice to not be master. So why not put it in the laws so that those who are lawless and cruel and mean don't have the power to over women that way, right? Because you're already doing it. It's basically saying, right, you're already doing it anyway, so what's the harm in putting it in as a law? And men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as vassals of your sex, right? So they're saying, like, men of sense, men of reason, hate those laws and customs that allow men to treat us this way. Regard us then as beings placed by providence under your protection. So people who are by God have put them under their protection, and in imitation of the supreme being, which both of this it's God that she's talking about. Make use of that power for only for our happiness, right? So she first kind of states what she wants, and then gives a threat with, if we're determined we're not going to be bound by these laws if we're not included in them, which was what the language of the Declaration of Independence said, and used like the word tyrant and rebellion, right? But then also is like, look, you're already doing it, so what's the big deal? So this is his response. Again, his response was longer. This is the part that was directly related to the part we just read. And there's a lot going on here. They continue writing, like, so as much as his response sounds harsh, she was pissed off. She actually writes a letter, I didn't put that one in, to her friend, where she repeats. She basically is like, this is what my husband said. Can you freaking believe this? This is ridiculous. And we should have a rebellion. And then she writes back to John and is like, yeah, well, we're totally going to have a rebellion and threatening discord. And then the subsequent letters kind of stop talking about it. Whether that's like, oh, well, it's too late at this point. And then they certainly continue to have a loving and friendly relationship. So, I don't know how, she obviously was not happy with his response, but this didn't end their marriage and certainly didn't seem to end even their loving relationship with each other based on their letters. But she was initially pissed by this response based on her letter to her friend. As to your extraordinary code, so this is John Adams, right? As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. I mean, so, right, he starts it off, well, it wasn't the start, but when he's talking about this, it's, oh, that's a good one, that's funny, ha ha ha, right? We have been told that our struggles have loosened the band of government everywhere. And then he lists people that are under control or authority, right? So women, students, indentured servants, slaves, Native Americans, I don't remember if I said them. All of these people are now challenging the system, is what he's saying, right? But your letter was the first intimation, that another tribe more numerous and powerful than the rest has grown discontented, right? And that tribe is women, which is 50% of the population, roughly. So he is saying, right, he did acknowledge, right, that this is a large group of women. So he's like, look, we have been aware that, and they lamented that the Revolutionary War was not a social revolution. Okay, so that's important to know. The Revolutionary War was revolutionary in terms of government and the idea of getting rid of a king and setting up a democratic government. That the king didn't have a God-given right to rule. That was revolutionary, for sure. But the main leaders of this, it certainly doesn't mean everyone, but the ones that became the founding fathers that set up, that wrote the Declaration of Independence, that set up the Constitution, they definitely did not want to have a social revolution. And I think this shows that here, what John Adams is saying is, we don't want a social revolution. We weren't looking to, he's not saying it's a good thing that all these other groups of people are also challenging the system. He thinks it's a negative thing. And they say, now women have joined in. So that, like I said, that we, the Revolutionary War was setting a precedent for new things, but they definitely were not a social revolution. Again, as I said, they did not want to change the social structure. It was supposed to be the white wealthy men on top and everyone else underneath, and they didn't want that to change. That's very clear by how they set up certain aspects of the government, and it's very clear, in his response here too. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out. Blot it out is like the erasing of the time, right? They're writing with pen and quill and ink, so you can't erase it. So if you wrote something that you didn't want to actually send, or in a letter, you'd blot it out with ink so they couldn't read it. So that's what he's saying. He's like, this is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out. I mean, so like he's also basically calling her like sassy, and that way, oh, you're so sassy. I won't depend upon it. We know better than to repeal. So here's the real response that I think is important with this. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. So I mean, it's basically saying like there is no way we are getting rid of our control. Although they are in full force, they are little more than theory. So here, it's interesting, they both play the same game of like kind of being forceful with something and then being like trying to persuade the other, right? Her attempt at persuasion was like, you're already not, treating us cruel and give up that title of master, so why not just put it in the laws? It's already in practice. This is his. Although the masculine systems are in full force, they're little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in full latitude. So yes, that's technically the law, but we don't actually practice it. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, we are the subjects. So he even goes further and is like, yes, legally it's here, but we're the subjects here, not the masters in practice. We have only the name of masters. Okay, so he's like, it's just a superficial title, so don't worry. But this is where I think it's interesting with how much he was against women having a voice in the government, getting rid of the masculine systems, as he calls it. This next part. And rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat. So, despotism of the petticoat. The petticoat, right, is the skirt thing they put over. If you watch the video of showing the colonial woman getting dressed, she mentions when she's putting on what's the petticoat, which was a woman's clothing. So it's very much a reference to women based on their clothing. That wasn't something that men used or wore. Despotism, cruel and harsh rule. So rather than subject us completely to the cruel and harsh rule of the petticoat of women, it's basically that's saying the cruel and harsh rule of women. I hope General Washington, George Washington, and all our brave heroes would fight to not have women be part of the government. I am sure every good politician would plot as long as he would against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, and oligarchy. A fine story indeed. Then it sounds like he's chuckling again at the end. A fine story indeed. But what's significant with all of these words here? Despotism and on. These are all hated words of the Revolutionary War. They're all bad. They're all seen as bad rule. Some obviously by the name despotism, by its definition, cruel and harsh rule. Empire isn't necessarily a negative word, but it was for the patriots at the time, because empire and king or monarchy was the British, which was they felt were oppressing them. So despotism negative, empire negative, monarchy, kingship, right? They were very anti-king. Aristocracy, anti-noble too. It's why the U.S. doesn't have nobility. Because the nobility was seen as part of that issue. Plus, most of the people who had originally come over to the colonies were not noble. And so it got swept into that and was set up, even though you're going to have like a class system and definitely have some pretend nobility, perhaps is the best word. We'll see it in the South. When we talk about the plantation elite and women there, they tried to create a sense that the plantation elite, the men and women, were the nobles of the South. But there was no official nobility. And that was seen as bad. oligarchy. So you have this one is rule of the few, and this one here is mob rule. So these were all bad systems of rule and control. So he's saying, and he lists a ton of them. It's not like he just like one. No, I'm going to list all of these horrible systems of political power, and suggest that he hopes that all the heroes of the Revolutionary War and General Washington would all fight against having women be in the government and have the right to vote, as much and as long as they would fight against this list of bad types of rule. I mean, that's crazy in that part, right? I mean, it's not surprising she was totally pissed, and it was like, can you believe he freaking said this? We need to figure out how to fight back. And it doesn't there. She apparently didn't figure out how to fight back for very long. But one more letter is all we have, at least in letter form, of what they tried. But that's pretty like damning to suggest that like the idea for him of having women be have the right to vote, be part of the laws, and have a position within that system was somehow just as bad as all of these negative types of rule that everyone in that time and that Abigail Adams would have known were seen as these horrible, awful systems. You know, that's saying a lot. As far as he could have just said like, you know, that's not going to work out right now. We're having a hard enough time figuring out the law codes as it is, and we can't really bring in that. Plus, remember, political realm, men, domestic sphere realm, women, it just doesn't work. You know, he could have said it that way. And instead, it's like this harsh critique of how he will never, ever, on my life, ever let women have a say in the government. And then laughs at it again. Like, at the beginning, he says I cannot but laugh like it's a joke, but then seems to take it very seriously as why he wouldn't do it. And then the fine story indeed sounds like he's chuckling again at the end. So whether he was totally serious, or if she read this and knew that he was being bombastic about stuff and that was his nature, I guess you could argue that to a degree, but it still shows the significance of what women were up against in trying to get into the political realm, to have a political identity. It wasn't just a small thing where men were kind of like, nah, we kind of like it this way, and, you know, domestic sphere, political sphere. No, this suggests that women were really up against this ardent belief that women had no role in the political sphere. And yet at the same time, they were okay with women doing it informally, being the Daughters of Liberty, supporting it when it supported what the men wanted. But the instant women were wanting things that the men didn't want, then it's like, whoa, 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 absolutely not. And we'll fight against that. So that was part of it as well. So I really like this letter. I know it's used a lot as a big one, but I really like it because it shows not only women trying to get into the political structure legally and wanting that from 1776, but at the same time how ardently opposed men were, or at least some men were, to that system. And I think it helps explain why it took so long. So you think about it, from 1776 to 1920s, women were trying to get the right to vote. And it didn't happen until the 19th Amendment in the 1920s. And this wasn't the only time they pushed for it. We'll look at it as it keeps coming up. It's going to come up with the Civil War and the Abolition Movement. It's going to come up in the mid to late 1800s. And it's just going to keep pressing more and more and more. It's going to come up after World War I, and then finally it does happen. But even then, some women are going to be excluded from that unofficially, but still excluded from it. And that it kind of, I think, helps explain why it took so long for women to get the right to vote. If this is the sentiment that some men had, or at least some of the men in power had, you're going up against a lot to change that idea and have it be acceptable, with all while having no representation and no voice, as she mentions, in the actual government that makes the laws. So you're having to do it from the outside and up against this kind of sentiment. Okay, so that is Abigail Adams and Remember the Ladies. What I want to look at next then is, let's see, we're out of political identity now. Conditions in the home front during the war. Okay, so let's see. Oops. We are on B. So we'll just say conditions on the home front. So there were one of the things we already mentioned with the deputy husbands was a lack of food. Women consistently found themselves a lack of food or high prices. Well, it doesn't have to be an arrow. It did lead to high prices, but it was both. Okay, so sometimes it was just because there were high prices. Other times it was just high prices, or that there literally was not food to be found, even if you could pay for it. That women found themselves having to try to, not just feed themselves, but feed their children while their husbands were gone, while dealing with a shortage in food, or sometimes really high prices. Which is why it's not surprising that I mentioned in the last lecture that women sometimes fought back and banded together and sacked the merchant stores that were having outrageous prices. Again, those who raised their prices, some were left alone. It was the ones that were really price gouging and taking advantage of the situation because they were so desperate to have food because they had to feed their children. And with those super price gouging things, it almost made it impossible except for the super wealthy. And so women did find on a regular basis that they were having just for basic struggle to survive by finding food while the war was going on. And it is different, right? Because not everywhere experienced warfare. Depending on where you lived, some areas did not see much actual battle action because the battles were taking place in different locations. Whereas others, where they lived, the battles were taking place right near their houses. So one of the things that did happen is that there were often times where homes were near or in the middle of battle. Now, they didn't usually start that way because at least how the British organized and how the Continental Army organized, they kind of lined up in an empty field and fought. But the militia were much more kind of like hit and run kind of stuff. Jump in and attack and take off, which was a better tactic considering that the British were the best disciplined military out there. And the Continental Army, it was disastrous. When they first fought, they had to deal with people running away. They're like, oh shit, this is not, I didn't sign up for this crap. And the British were intimidating. And so they're like, peace out. And they're like, no, you can't leave. That's desertion. And so the militia they were volunteers versus the Continental Army, you signed up to be in the military. And so the volunteers were like, why would we fight that way? That's stupid. I'm not going to do that. Let's do something that actually helps us win. And we have smaller numbers, so what can we do? The British, rules of war is an interesting thing. This is agreed upon, or supposed to be agreed upon rules of how you fight a war. But it's war, and it usually doesn't follow that. But the British cried foul, and like, that's not how you fight. And they saw them as uncivilized. They're like, that's not how you fight in a civilized society. You guys are cheating. And they're like, it's war. Like, everything kind of goes at this point, like, for that situation. But it meant that homes either kind of got in the way, and if you knew in advance, like, you left. But there were other times where these battles kind of broke out, and your home was off to the side. It wasn't on the battlefield. But this led to let's put it under this, stray bullets. And there were women who were killed in their homes by stray bullets that came through, or cannons, right? Cannons did a lot more damage. Weapons, stray bullets is fine with that, but cannons did a lot more damage. They could be quite large, and like it could destroy part of a house. And there's definitely there were news articles of women and some children who were killed in their home because of loose fire, if you will. And then the next thing was the requirement. There's always a requirement, but the extra need to protect the children. Right? You have women now having this responsibility of not just protecting your children from day-to-day stuff, but protecting your children from stray bullets, protecting your children from really attacks, being killed, and being threatened. This goes hand in hand with, we'll put physical violence and rape. So, this totally varied depending on the commanders. You had British commanders, and this wasn't only the British. There were some patriots that were either in the militia or the Continental Army that also threatened, beat up, or raped women that were loyalists. So this was not, again, remember we talked about sexual violence is always used against women in throughout history. It's always something they have to contend with, no matter what group or who they are. It is something that's used to control, or just to show that they have power over them. So what women experienced with this varied. Again, if you were not where any battles were taking place and no armies were near you, this didn't come up. But it very much varied based on who the military commander was in the British Army. So you had one British general who did not even let his men, the soldiers, swear in front of a woman. They were punished if they were caught cussing in front of a woman. You can guarantee that group of the military, the British military, were not raping women, because he had a very strict expectation of behavior. On the other side, there was a British general who encouraged his men to rape women, to attack them, to intimidate them, and to rape them. He joked about it. We have written records of it. He encouraged them. He claimed it was part of war. It was part of the tactical, psychological warfare, essentially. He didn't use that word, but that's basically what he was saying. So you can guarantee that then women were definitely raped and attacked in those areas where his army went. So really, the experience of women in the home front and with violence and treatment really did depend on the regional areas of where they were at. But we have cases of, and why this I said went to protecting the children is you definitely had stray soldiers or soldiers that came in, and they would take over the house. Right, they would be like, oh, we need this house for a base for this next battle, and we're totally coming in. And with this, there would be expectation that you feed the men in the military, and whatever else that they needed. They often took property and livestock besides food. So you could end up being kind of like stripped of all your property and your livelihood for survival and feeding your kids, because the military came in and was like, we're going to use your home as a base, and then totally just take whatever the hell we want. And then when we leave, good luck. But the other thing that where this happened and connected to protecting the children, so the need and desire to protect your children, not only from stray bullets, but from the military themselves when they showed up in the house. There was also women who were threatened that you either let me have sex with you or I'm going to kill your children. And so women who were raped, even if they said fine and didn't put up a fight, because that was the only choice for protecting their children. So there was violence, there was physical and sexual attacks on women during the war. And again, it was on both sides. We have more records from the British side of what they did, probably because the colonists were interested in keeping that to be like, aha, see how bad the British were. But we know it happened on both sides, and the total number that we have is probably really low because women didn't often report this. For most of history, and even still to this day, reporting rape often gets the woman in trouble, whether that's legally, whether that's in just socially. It was dangerous to report it because that then went to the women as being, not... there's not that they committed adultery per se, but that somehow they weren't sexually pure anymore, and then they were shamed and they were shunned, or your husband rejected you because of rape, or people whispered and gossiped about you and called you a whore because of rape. Like, so women often didn't report it. They have some numbers on it, but it's not even close to accurate because you guarantee that a lot of women wouldn't have mentioned it. But we know some of that stuff that's happening, and so that the need to protect the children from just the horrors of war or the lack of food, and kind of and then the violence and making sure that they aren't killed, that all of that was an extra burden on women in the home front, and so, like I said, how they experienced it. Sometimes you experienced it and experienced the battles and the soldiers. Other times, life kind of went on as normal. It really, really depended on that. And of course, it was different in some of the wealthier areas versus the countryside. So more of this stuff tended to happen in the countryside than in towns. They tended not to have battles, except for, like, I guess, Lexington and Concord, which were the earliest battles. More like skirmishes. But they didn't have, like, the full-fledged battles. Usually didn't take place in, like, large towns or cities. It was on the outskirts. And then, sure, some of the towns could experience as the military march through them. But the more people that were around, the more insulated you were and protected than when you were on the countryside and it was, 100 acres before the next farm and there was no one else around to intervene. And so that definitely, and then the South, the fighting was much more brutal as it moved southward. And so there definitely was more violence that took place in the southern regions of the Revolutionary War. Okay, so that's the conditions of the home front. Well, actually, that's for one. Okay, there's still more. So looking at other groups of people, let's say it is the home front, but yeah, we'll just keep it on home front and society. How other groups experience the war. So we already talked about the Loyalists. I want to mention the Quakers briefly, because they definitely had a hard time. So the Quakers were people who were pacifists. They were against violence, and so they did the men, right? The women are going to be impacted by this, even though they didn't have a choice to fight or not fight in the war. But the men did not fight in the war. Most actually supported the Patriots, like they wanted them to win, but their religious beliefs prevented them from fighting. But for many people, this was really hard to accept or understand. And essentially, both sides, the Loyalists and the Patriots, saw them as cowards and traitors. So if you refuse to fight, can't get that right there. If they refused to fight, then they were for the other side. And while, again, a lot of this was initially targeted towards the men who were refusing to fight, the attacks were on everyone. So there were attacks on the towns and the people, including women. One town was burned down. So before the Revolutionary War, the Quakers often really actually congregated in towns together, and they had Quaker society. They were actually the first to ban slavery in their communities. You could not be a Quaker and own slaves. You could not live in Quaker towns and own slaves. Far before everyone else, far before the Revolutionary War, they had started doing that. And so they kind of had they were Quaker towns. Those end because of the Revolutionary War, because of the hate, because of the violence and the attacks that took place on the Quakers, because they refused to fight for either side. And so they got hate from both sides. And women were not exempt from this, even though it was again initially targeted towards the men who weren't fighting. The whole community of Quakers and their religious beliefs and structure and their communities got attacked, to the point that, like I said, one of their towns was burned down. One of the other things that they ended up getting attacked for, and some were killed for, both men and women, was that they believed in providing medical aid, right, to anyone that needed it. And, I mean, they weren't alone in this. There were others that tried to help, injured soldiers, no matter what side they were from. But there were plenty of people who didn't agree with that, or it was shut down. The Quakers, while they, again, supported the Patriot ideals, most of them, they firmly believed in helping anyone who needed medical aid. So they set up hospitals. Like, well, we can't fight, but we'll help with hospitals. And they set up hospitals, which the women were very much a part of. Set up makeshift hospitals. And the women helped as nurses. And they treated anyone that needed it. And this also they got crap for. So like I said, it kind of, the Quakers don't go away. When we talk about the Civil War, you have some of the Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who are some of the most famous abolitionists and women's rights supporters. They were Quakers. So the religion didn't go away, the community did because of this. The next group will look at Native Americans and how Native American women experienced this, and actually the consequences too after. So you had with Native Americans, they much actually like African American communities as well, had a decision to make on who do they support, and it wasn't agreed upon. But especially with Native Americans, there was this expectation of picking a side, and there was definitely disagreement. You had tribes that supported the British and tribes that supported the colonists. It actually split the Iroquois Confederacy in half. So the Iroquois Confederacy was actually a confederacy of several tribes, and they were large and powerful at the time for tribes that were in that area. And they couldn't agree, and it split them in half, which weakened them and just made it easier for the colonists and or Americans after the war taking over their land and killing some of them as well. So women found themselves, remember we talked about women's roles as not only as elders, but that they were looked to for advice. Women were continued to be looked to for advice, both on war themselves, whether they should just go for support. We'll put support or war. So whether they say they support but don't fight, or whether they support and fight, right, and whether they had the means to do that. Women were also used for advice. Those that were married to British or colonists. And the idea being, right, that they could give insight into who would be the better choice, right? What are their plans? How are they going to treat us? Are they going to respect our land? Are we going to have freedom under them, right? And some were lured by the language of the colonists: freedom, equality, liberty, which of course later finds out doesn't apply to anyone but white people, and really white men specifically. But at the time, right, that language sounded promising. And so women then played an important role, because being married to some of the colonists and women that were married to some of the British, they could be like, yeah, this is what I know. This is what at least what my husband and being around, this is what they're talking about. This is what they're planning. And they helped also negotiate treaties and agreements of support, hoping, right, because all of this was under the idea of, what is going to allow the independence of the tribes and retaining their land. Right? What is going to allow, the question, like, what's going to allow us to not only have our agency within our tribes, but the freedom to keep our lands that isn't going to have them come take over. And women were often the ones that were looked to for helping make that decision. So they played a very important role. Of course, ultimately, right, so they fought for their independence, cultural integrity, protection of the land and property. All of those things were parts of it. Obviously, what happened is that the British lost, and the colonists, even with some promises made, and why they, I think, more supported the British than the colonists, which shouldn't be surprising. The British were better at respecting treaties and Native American territory. Part of that reason was because the British didn't live there, and so it was like, yeah, okay, sure, we'll put this as the treaty line, and say that colonists can't, move into your territory and take your territory, and then but they didn't live there, and weren't interested in moving there, so it was easy for them to hold up. And some of it was an attempt to respect that more. Some of it was just because they didn't live there. The colonists were obviously not very good at doing that. They constantly promised things and then took their land anyways. So it's not surprising that more tribes supported the British and thought that they would at least, both options sucked, but the British seemed that we're more likely to maintain our land and property in cultural ways with the British than with the colonists. But obviously some disagreed. Because there were some that supported the Patriots. But the end result was that once the British were gone, any kind of reserve for holding off on Native American territory was gone. And you had a rush into Indian land. And not only that, but you had people who paid for the scalps, like to scalp Native Americans. And they paid per scalp. And in a direct and intentional attempt to clear out and eradicate a group of people so that they could take their land without opposition. This didn't happen everywhere, but there were places with it, and there definitely was a mass rush to just take the land, and not only that, but then continue to move westward into new territory, which hadn't been involved with before. So it wasn't good, and it fundamentally changes women's roles even further, as there's an attempt and push to remove Native Americans. You have the Indian Removal Act that's going to come a little bit later, where they actually push out the rest of, the Cherokee, one of the remaining tribes. There were five, they were called the 5 civilized tribes. And they called them that because they were the 5 that were kind of left in the eastern coast region. And they had been the ones the most to assimilate and adopt white European style and structure. The Cherokee most of all. They actually had farms and fences and individual land plots within their tribal land. And then they had created a code of laws that was very similar to the Constitution. So they had mimicked a lot of that. And most of them spoke English as well as their native language. And yet, you know, that because that would have been the argument. Well, if you just assimilate, then things will be fine. And then it was like, no, but we still want your land, so off you go. And so then all the other tribes had been pushed off or eradicated by the time of Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act. So it shows you the devastation that took place from the end of the Revolutionary War. And women, especially, like I said, they were forcibly relocated to reservations, and many, many women died along the Trail of Tears as they were pregnant, taking care of children, taking care of the elderly, and were often the ones that didn't get enough food and succumbed to the elements. And this fundamentally changed some of their any remaining kind of authority that they had within the tribes, mostly dissipated with the shift to reservations as well. So devastating impact for women, Native American women, when the war was over. And then lastly, looking at African Americans, both free black populations and community and slaves. And they too, had to make a decision about, to a degree, about what they were wanting to do. Whether that was, we'll see, to support, to hope to use it to their advantage, to escape. And there was initial hope based on the language. And you see this with I forgot to put that one, the poet, I think it was from, was it this one here? Yeah, Phyllis Wheatley. And she wrote a lot of poems as well as letters. She was an ardent Christian who also was, as much as she talked about Christianity and that, was also looking at, she had been a former slave, and her abduction from Africa and slavery. And so she had a lot of, it was Christian themes, it was slavery themes, it was themes connecting to Africa. And one of her poems to the Right and Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth, His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for North America, she connects the word like freedom and tyranny, and hoping that this will this political turmoil will the colonists will recognize the parallels to what's going on with slavery. And so there was definitely, like I said, that language that made people initially hopeful that they would be able to recognize that connection. And so she does in her poem, she talks about the freedom, right? The no more America in mournful strain of wrongs and grievances undressed complain. No longer shalt thou dread the iron chain which wanton tyranny with lawless hand had made, and with it meant to enslave the land. Should you, my lord, while you pursue my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Africa's fancy happy seat, with pangs excruciating most molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved, such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway. So she's talking about the political turmoil in America and the grievances that haven't been addressed by the British, and hoping that they'll no longer dread the iron chain. And then so she cleverly, it's really clever, because it's both alluding to the language of the revolutionaries with the iron chains of the British, the king and the monarchy, and it also is the referencing slavery, and is the transitioning line to where she then begins to talk about slavery, right? That tyranny and actually both of these, with tyranny, which wanton tyranny with lawless hand hath made, and with it meant enslaved the land, is both, again, it's the duality of talking about it from the king and the tyranny of the British king, and it's talking about being enslaved. And so then and should you, my lord, will you pursue my song, wonder where my love of freedom came from? I was kidnapped as a baby, taken from my father's hands and put into slavery. That's what she's saying. So you have that parallel, and women that were a former slave, right? Phyllis, and this was one of the readings I had to do on page 145. The information about her starts through Women's Eyes on 141. But the actual poem I just was reading part of is on 145. So Phyllis Wheatley, right, she was a poet, and used that letters and we'll put letters up here. She used poetry and letters, right, to write, to support not only freedom and colonists, or at least being sympathetic to colonist viewpoints before the war, but connecting it to slavery and fighting against slavery. So, and fighting against slavery. So you had women that that had been former slaves, and were now free, that were writing these petitions, these poems, just like the Hannah Griffiths poem. She was using her poetry to make a point. And a lot of them, like I said, if you're reading through the different stuff during this time period, a lot of the petitions, a lot of the poems, a lot of the letters, and they did a whole bunch of things. You had formal petitions to the government, you had poems, you had newspaper articles, you had letters to friends and family and to other people that they thought of influence. They all took that parallel of that language and connected it not only to the language of this is good, right, freedom and fighting against tyranny and control, and supporting that initially, and then connecting it to slavery and why that should be considered as well. So you had women just as much that were, like, supporting, like, talking about the early, Revolutionary War activities in the African American communities, writing and fighting to show not only their support, but the connection to what it should be doing for slavery. And they really did think, if this is the language that's being used, this is good, because it means that then slavery will end. That did not happen, but that was the hope early on. You also then had slave women. And this was more things that they had to consider during the war than before and during, right? Phyllis Wheatley was writing that the poem that she wrote was before war broke out. It was when the political tensions and conflicts were still happening. But slave women actually had different experiences because of the war itself that they had to make decisions on, because they didn't have the luxury of picking support for a side or other. It was more about how to obtain freedom for their children. There were a couple of things that occurred within slavery and for women during the war, really, and not so much before, but during the war, and then after. So one of the things, let's get that back there. One of the things that happened is, if you're looking at during the war, first we'll start there. You had we'll say instability that war created. And because of this leads to two things. One was that it was a small percentage though, so we'll just to be clear with that, some slave owners freed their slaves. Right, and the reason for this, so we'll put it here, small percentage. This wasn't a lot, but there were some, and there were two reasons for this. One was that some slave owners, it was because of what do you call it? Revolutionary War ideology. Let's just call it that. The language and beliefs of the Revolutionary War, the freedom, equality, liberty, like so I was talking about, is that there were some people, this is going to happen more in the North than in the South, but there were some in the South and then more in the North, so to the point that there were northern colonies that after the war ended, they began the process of abolishing slavery. So that did happen. But then you had individual slave owners that because of Republican War ideology and that language, right, realized that that slavery paralleled that, and it didn't make sense. And if they were true patriots and believers, that often came up as like, wait, this doesn't coincide. And so you had some that did that. Some did it though. Some freed slaves. Because they either couldn't manage their plantations. So this would be like loyalists who were going over to the British side, and they were like, well, even if my wife and children are staying, they're not going to be able to maintain this. I'm just going to free them. Or because they believed that it was going to happen anyways. So they may not be ardent patriots and that ended up seeing how wrong slavery was, especially within the context of what they were arguing. But just that it was going to happen, and so they might as well free them. Again, this was still a relatively small number, but you do have women and children and families that were freed by individual slave owners. The other thing that was still connected to the instability that war created was the ability for women, especially, to escape. So running away as a slave was difficult. And the more elaborate systems of the Underground Railroad and that structure that at least was an aid to help slaves run away successfully, and that wasn't always successful anyway. But if you were a slave and closer to the Civil War, so the Underground Railroad didn't happen and wasn't created and established until later, when it got closer to what was considered the antebellum period, right before the Civil War, the Abolition Movement, and then the Civil War. The Abolition Movement that took place right before the Civil War really then helped create the Underground Railroad. If You were much more likely as a slave to be successful in escaping if you had the aid of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad worked in two ways. You had what was called a conductor, and then that was a person who came, like, so Harriet Tubman, who was a former slave, she was the most famous conductor and the most successful. And the conductor would come to you and then guide you out into the North, and they stayed with you the whole way. That was the best way because they knew the routes, they knew the people, they knew the safe houses. You were most likely to be successful with them. The other way the Underground Railroad worked was that through songs, through passing of information between slaves, you would be given starting points depending on where you lived. And it would be directions that they sang in songs openly in front of at least the overseers, if not the slave owners. But they didn't know what it was, the slave owners or overseers. And it was directions and information to tell you where to go to the first safe house. And then you would be directed, once you made it to the first safe house, you'd be given food and rest, and then directed to the next safe house. And you went safe house by safe house until you made it to the North. If you just took off on your own, much lower probability. Funny thing, when I was a kid, I totally thought the Underground Railroad was an actual underground railroad. I don't remember when, I think it was high school when I finally realized oh, it's not an actual underground railroad. But they talked about it as underground railroad and then the conductor, and I was like, oh, so they built this whole underground railroad system to ferry the slaves away. No. But it sounded right when I was a kid. So the women, for women, running away was difficult. Women were less likely to run away. And the reason for this was almost always because of children. It was really hard. So like I mentioned, if you just took off and tried to escape, you had a high chance of being caught. You really needed a system to help you get through the South to be successful. And then of course, just there were places to run away when it was North versus South as it got close to the Civil War. With the Revolutionary War, one of the problems was places to run away to, right? That would allow you to be free, right? That was the key there. There was less of that during the Revolutionary War period. But women, no matter what, whether it was in this period or later, were less likely to run away because of the children, because it was really hard to escape with children. Running away, even with the Underground Railroad, was exhausting and difficult. It required you at times to be quiet, to not get caught. It required you at times to walk a really long way, and deal with very harsh conditions. And of course, that's really, really difficult for children to do successfully. Children would be the reason that they would be caught if you brought a child along, because they could, they didn't understand and you couldn't be quiet, or they couldn't make the trip or whatever. And women were very often not willing to leave their kids behind. And so women, just in percentage-wise, slave women ran away far less than men. They did run away. So it's not, I don't want it to seem like they didn't run away. They did. Just percentage-wise, they ran away less than men because there were harder choices to make. And when they did, they tried to take their children with them when they could. And so it created a more difficult situation if you decided to do so. Well, so one, you now have the Revolutionary War created a place to go that was more obvious, and an opportunity. Because of the instability, there was less structure or ability to manage the slaves some of the time, so they had more opportunities to run away. The British played on this because the British offered freedom to escape slaves, both men and women. And they said, if you make it, they didn't help them run away, but if they made it to British areas And then there was a caveat. It wasn't just that. If you made it to the British area and you supported the British war efforts, then you would be freed. So for men, right, that was fighting. For women, that was, for women, supporting the, oops, I'll put it underneath it. Supporting the British war efforts was like cleaning the camps, cooking, sometimes nursing, right? Those type of things. And if they did that, then the British said that they would be free. And this was looked positive because women and children were included in this. So they didn't just target men and say only if men come and fight. They specifically said that women and children were included in this option. And then because of the instability of war, and because, like I said, the plantations weren't always as closely guarded, because either the husband was off fighting, or the instability and chaos that the war created, or if a battle came through, it gave the war gave women opportunities to escape, and to escape often with their children. So you did have actually more women that escaped during the Revolutionary War than in other times because of this situation. And there are many women that took that. Unfortunately, the British didn't win for them, and so they were not, so here's how it worked. If they had won, then the idea was that all of those slaves who had escaped and supported them, they'd be free. After the war and the British lost, some former slaves that had escaped to the British side were actually able to go to England, and were freed, because England had ended up stopping slavery before the U.S. And so it's for the, I guess the ones that were probably the most lucky were the ones that actually made it to England. But not everyone did. There were, if they weren't taken with the British when they left, some were actually dropped off on an island, and that didn't go so well because it wasn't really livable. Others were left in the colonies, where then they were tried to live as free. Some did. Others ended up being captured and put back into slavery, and then some were sold back to the colonists as slaves before the British left. So there was a variety of end results that happened, none of which ultimately was, well, that's not none, a lot of which was not ultimately freedom. So we put the last one there, like end results, right, is that obviously we'll put it here with this, well, I said with the British. We'll talk about the end results as well. So, right, with the British, we'll put it here. Sorry. I'm just trying to decide which outline to put it in, but we'll just go put it here because we'll put all the end results. So, for those that escaped to the British, right, it depended on the situation. Some ended up free, right? Whether that was going to England or staying free in the colonies and not being recaptured. And some were put or sold back into slavery. So it just depended on the situation. Then the other result, as I mentioned, that you did have some that were freed by the individual slave owners that we mentioned. The other thing that was in result is that some northern colonies began to move towards gradual abolition. So this was not, and they did this because of the Revolutionary War. but this was not immediate abolition. Gradual abolition was within a time frame, and that ranged from usually 5 to 7 years. Although there was a few that were 10, so we'll put 5 to 10 years. And so it said within a period of 5 to 10 years, and again, someone was 5, someone was 8, someone was 10. Within this general range of 5 to 10 years, the colonies said that slavery would end. At the end of that time frame, slavery was over. This usually meant that you were free either at end of time frame, or if the owner decided early, or children. So children born after the start of gradual abolition were born free. So for children, there was some benefit of a more immediate, depending on if you were born during that time. If you're already alive, then it was either once you were 18, if you hit 18 before the 5 to 10 year frame of whatever their timeline was, or the end of the time. It just depended. And then gradual abolition also, early gradual abolition gave compensation to slave owners. Not to the slaves, to the slave owners. And it also usually meant not full citizens. So you might be free, but you weren't considered a citizen afterwards. So it was a start, but it wasn't immediate. It was those, there were definitely, like I said, it's what led to most of the northern states becoming free states by the time of the antebellum period, when you have the tensions between the North and the South, and then the North actively pushing for the abolition movement, or at least people in the North actively pushing for the abolition movement. So how the northern states ended up free by that time was because of gradual abolition, and because individually northern states, or colonies that became states, began to move towards freedom for slaves and ending slavery. But almost all of them practiced gradual abolition. And then for others, right, the end result for a lot was they remained in slavery. So there we go. Don't crash on me here. They remained in slavery. It didn't change anything. You know, you had this initial hope and desire. Is it gonna? There it goes. It's telling me I need to wrap up. Remained in slavery, right? Nothing changed. You had this initial hope with the language and the structure, and then ultimately nothing happened. Okay, so after the war, let's see, we're on number, was that all one? Yeah. Okay, so 2, after the war, what happened for women, besides what we already looked at, right? Some of this we already looked at. After the war, there is one big thing that happened for white women, more than anyone else, and that was Republican motherhood. So you have the founding of the nation, which did not include, when they started writing the Constitution, women as much as Abigail Adams wanted. But one of the things that did come out of it was this idea of Republican motherhood. And this was the idea that women had an obligation to teach the values of the Republican ideology. So women, specifically mothers had a duty to teach their children Republican values. And I don't mean Republican like Republican Party. Teach their children, right, Republican values. Republican here means like the Republic. So the new United States that was developing. That's what they had a duty to teach their children. And in order to do this, though, right prior to this, let's look real quick at the traditional role so far. Traditional role of mothers was to teach their daughters, not the sons, the household domesticity. So that's, what you saw in the Midwife's Tale of weaving, sewing, cooking, cleaning. So they would be good wives. So you taught your daughters what the skills that they needed to do in the domestic sphere, so when they became wives, they would know how to do it. That was the traditional role. Now, with Republican motherhood, it was that you were going to teach both sons and daughters. And while there was still an expectation for daughters of teaching them household domesticity, you now had this new thing that you were expected to teach them up to a point, right, with Republican values. But in order to do that, women needed to be educated to teach their children. So there became a debate on women and education, and what women should be taught, how much, right? The importance of that. But there was support for education, not only for women and girls, right? So the women to teach them, and the girls for actually going to elementary school now. So it definitely had a big benefit in the education component, although there was still a lot of debate of what that meant. What do we educate women in? How much education should women have? And there definitely was, within this debate, right, there was some that education meant still feminine ideals. And so that would be like music, literature, religious stuff, the Bible and whatnot, household domestic stuff, and some history, because you needed to know the history for the Republic, right? Republican values and how the Patriots fought off the evil British and all of that. And then others, right, who argued, so this was one idea. The other idea was that women were capable of learning equal to men and should be taught as such. And the readings that I had you do with Benjamin Rush, and looking at Benjamin Rush and then Judith Murray, basically argue those 2 points, right? So Benjamin Rush argues these, and he does argue for the importance of education, but it's definitely those. And then Judith Murray argues basically why women are as equal or capable as men. She talks about how that the argument that women are somehow not equal or deficient in mental ability, right? That they're saying that that's actually only because acquiring knowledge hath been denied us. The inferiority of our sex cannot fairly be deduced from thence. May we not trace its source in the difference of education and continued advantages? So she's specifically saying, look, this whole argument that women aren't as smart as men or not as capable, that's because we've been denied the education. You can trace it to the fact that we've been denied that education. And if you educated women the same as men, they would be equally as capable. And that it says that, right, that meantime, she herself is most unhappy. She feels the want of a cultivated mind. So she argued that women were wanting and desiring that education. Is she united to a person whose soul nature made her equal to her own? Education hath set him so far above her that in those entertainments which are productive of such rational felicity, she is not qualified to accompany him. Now she does bring it back to being a partner with your husband, that's creating this inequality. And this inferiority, and that you should be then educating women to the same degree and level. And she much like other women who had done this, then mentions, like, I know that, like, people are going to argue, well, we're inferior because physically we are not as strong as men. And she's like, I'm going to not argue that. Sure, women are not physically as strong as men, but that's not the same thing as the mind. The mind is equal and capable. And it's just because of these lack of advantages that have been given to them. Whereas Benjamin Rush creates a list of kind of, there's one of the things that's important with this is it is an assertion. It's just an assumption that women should be educated. He starts off by, yeah, women should be educated. Let's look at what that should include. So it's interesting. There doesn't become the debate about whether women should be educated anymore, just how. And so he lists, and he does, I guess he does support it still, because there were, I guess, you can't say everyone. There were definitely some people who still thought women shouldn't be educated. But by the most part, it became an assumption if you were going to have promote the Republican mother, be a Republican mother, and support the Republican ideology, women had to be educated enough to teach the children those ideals. And so he says, look, it's just like being a mother. This is, and connected to it. Being a teacher is just like being a mother. Because they're already instructing children on these processes. So this is how women get education and get to go to public school. They connect it to the domestic sphere. Remember how I talked about that everything was going to get, that we see in advances for women gets connected to the domestic sphere? So you have the domestic sphere. Midwife is connected, right? Because it's giving birth, helping with birthing and caring for sick children. Well, mothers do that. That seems normal. They move education to it because, well, women instruct their children growing up. They already do that. And this is going to lead to teaching. After the Revolutionary War, so we have two kind of main jobs that women can do right now outside of the household. Well, one, midwife. After the Revolutionary War, because of Republican motherhood and because of this emphasis on education, it becomes acceptable for women to teach the elementary school. That had been solely a male job up to this point. Now, women actually go into the teaching field and teach the children in these like one-room schoolhouses because it gets connected to education, which gets connected to the domestic sphere. Again, we'll see other jobs, the nursing, that's going to get connected to the domestic sphere. Every job that then an opportunity outside of the household that women gets connected back to the domestic sphere to justify it. But he says the principal share of instruction of children naturally devolves upon the women. It becomes us, therefore, to prepare them to be a suitable education for the discharge of this most important duty of mothers. So that's how he's advocating, right, why women should be educated, because they're naturally going to be teaching their children and they need to be educated to do so. And then he kind of lists, here are the things that I think women should be educated with, which he talks about with English language, writing fair and legible, some knowledge of figures in bookkeeping so she can assist her husband with that, history, music and dancing, travel, poetry, moral essays, and Christian religion. So again, that more feminine ideal versus everything. But he does, the influence of female education would be still more extensive and useful in domestic life. So he still connects it back to the domestic sphere, especially those that promote it. But you do see how women, Judith Murray included, were promoting for a more all-encompassing education. And not all women agreed. There were women who definitely pushed for, we should be being taught everything. We are equal in our minds to men, and others women who said, no, our role is within the domestic sphere. So this education makes sense because it connects to that. But it was significant in adding that additional role of not only education, but then the teaching as a job that women could have outside of the home. Within that, and just a more emphasis on women and the importance they had as mothers in educating their children, not just training daughters to be good wives, but educating boys and girls, their sons and daughters, to be good citizens. Essentially, that you are now going to help conform your children to be good citizens. But it was with a sense of pride in this, that they'd created this republic, and the importance of teaching that to the children. But it definitely has some of those vibes of train your children to be productive citizens in our new republic. Okay, so that is where we are ending. We made it through, and it's a good thing I didn't try to continue it with the last lecture, because this one is equal in length. I do apologize. I am way too verbose, and there's just too much history to share. But hopefully you got that. It helped with the sources as well. I tried to make sure I covered all the sources, the ones I could find or that were easy, that were small enough to take pictures. I didn't put up Judith Murray and Benjamin Rush and Phyllis Wheatley because they were longer, and so it would have been multiple pages, and with the pictures it works better if it's shorter. But I tried to put up the ones I could, and then Abigail Adams. All right, so that's where we'll end there. We'll be looking at the Industrial Revolution and Low Mills next time.